the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Journalism and Communication, and Vitaly Portnikov, journalist and famous publicist. The first question is, are there journalist standards in war? And if so, what are those standards? Whom shall we start with? Can we have the microphone? Of course there are standards. The question is how much more urgent they are. If we're talking about standards, we have to separate on the one hand the standards of producing content, on the other hand, the standards of how we work or how journalists work in the field, how they procure information, so to speak, how they collect information. And I think in the context of the standards that are very important during the war, most important is working with the sources. It's become much more urgent for us to check our information that much more thoroughly, and to also to gain access to these. It's become much more difficult to gain access to these sources. And whereas previously we're talking about, checking information from in 2 or 3 sources, now it might not even be enough. And one of the subjects that is being raised now is perhaps how do you report on information that everybody knows? For instance, if we're talking about the deaths of military members, information that we may know unofficially, but that needs to be cleared from a high number of sources to clarify to what extent do the family know, to what extent is the information confirmed from official military sources, and you can continue digging into like to what extent are the military involved in collecting information about what happened to the person? Did the person actually died? Because we've seen examples. One possibility is, this is just one example of how important it is to check your information very thoroughly and not disseminate it before it's time, too early. And I think in addition to those standards, perhaps colleagues will talk about, information balance and checking information, subjects that can and not to be raised by journalists, but what we talk about and what we do not say, the idea of not saying something. How do you not turn this into self-censorship and keeping important information from the public? I mean, it's a whole matter for discussion. What is socially significant information during the war, and what should be held and reported on somewhat later? So when we talk about journalist standards, often you have the you get the impression that we're talking about some very complicated, high abstract matters. So I try to bring it down to earth. I compare it to like the technology of making sausage. What do you make sausage out of? Out of meat. Can you put toilet paper and wood shavings into kielbasa? No, you can't. What if there's war? No, you still can't. And if you put it, it's no longer sausage. That's kind of the way I see it. Of course, like you can see that because journalism is supposed to work according to certain standards, it has to work according to certain standards now as well. In some instances, the conditions of war may be the reason that some standard in some specific case cannot be maintained or upheld for 100%. Like Zoya said, the standard of operative quick news, when we know some information but we can't report it yet, even if it's confirmed, because there are limits to do with security or war, right? Or the balance of thoughts. Not in all cases can we provide balance of ideas. Not in all instances is the arithmetic balance the morally right choice. So, for instance, if the one party to the conflict is a person who supports the aggressor, right? Many, by the way, manipulate this and say, see, you violated the balance of thoughts. We have to balance this with Putin. No, we don't have to. We don't have to provide Putin equal time. We live in a certain legal and value frame that is in which Russia is the aggressor. It does not have the moral right, the moral claim to feature in each journalist material with their viewpoint. That's kind of the idea. But all of these are reasons for why we might not meet our own standards. But the fact that we, as people who study, what we see in detector media, we who study the media in Ukraine, what we see a lot is that the war is being used as a reason, as an excuse to get rid of standards. They say, well, look, there's a war. we're just going to work as if there are no standards. No, keeping to standards has really fallen in the media that we look at, in the media that we survey, and unfortunately, in many instances, you cannot explain this or excuse this by not having access to information, or because they fear to breach some security information, etc. I think it just has to do with the fact that people have let themselves go, so to speak. And these discussions seem to me very useful to remind journalists that, look, war is war, but you still have professional standards and values and rules and frames of your profession, and they're there. They apply. I might even I might even to, to raise the stakes a little bit. Does this mean, perhaps you will add, or perhaps your colleague, does this mean that standards cannot keep up with this story evolutionary, just like a historical moment dictates abandoning standard? Again, it really depends on, are you looking at standards as something that's imposed, or it's something that was created by the market in order to create quality process and product? I see the standards in the second for formulation. For me, these are rules that arose and solidified in the journalist profession based on the fact how we want our content and our product and our process to correspond to the needs of the audience, right? And if you look at it that way, I don't think that the war changes these demands for content and the process. I mean, are we supposed to start lying? Are we supposed to start swapping opinions for facts? Are we supposed to forego citing sources for our information and not tell where we got the information? Are we supposed to give only one-sided views when there is another side, but we don't like it? Again, with some exceptions when it is justified. I don't think so. Yes, thank you. So one of the first, basically, Dr. Ihor Mikhailin, who was also a scholar at the university of Karazin University, he wrote that journalism is an institution that collects and processes and spreads information for the common good of other institutions. And with this information that is then publicly available, we can understand how we ought to work or what we ought to do next. And in times of war, when of course the standards have taken a hit, of course, in terms of speed and fullness or commentary, that we have to now describe and systematize and present, where a commentary and opinion ends and where an official source begins. Of course, that affects the material. I am gratified that, as Otar has mentioned, that the value and the moral component have, if anything, gone up over the past 100 days of our war. To me, that is valuable, particularly as a director of a school of journalism, somebody who is trying to shape former experts and former colleagues, those who will be fighting in the information war and information front. The importance of this kind of emotional element, of this moral component, how it matters more than balance of opinion. Now that we've touched moral, so understand. Thank you. So we have to understand several things. That war journalism is a symbiosis of efforts, of state efforts and social effort, of the efforts of the state and society. And so in the earliest war weeks after the start of the war, when we got together here, I said that basically the main task of the state is to ensure both access to information and wartime censorship, which is still not provided. If this were set out in the legislation, many of these problems would fall off. In Israel, for instance, still not only during the war, but even during peacetime life, the names of those who have fallen in terrorist acts or soldiers who have died in terrorist attacks are only divulged after the are only divulged after the war censorship clears it. First, you state the fact of a wound or death. Only then does the war ministry let you publish the name. Now, this may take 48 hours, 72 hours, but it's the specific name, and it uh, doesn't hamper the intelligence services to work while working. None of this happened here, but there's still the manipulation of the possibility of access of information. Firstly, we don't have clear official information that can be used as the clear unified source. Obviously, there are daily speeches by the president, but they're more sermons than specific information. We have reports by the Ministry of Defense and the headquarters. They're factual. At the same time, people work as newsmakers who are not very clear in terms of what are their positions, like advisor to the head of the president's office. It's not even clear if he's an official or if he's freelancer. And these people speak in some blogger programs. They speak as independent experts, often in international platforms. And these opinions that they disseminate, we don't even know if they have access to classified information, and if they do, what they can report, are seen by, but this is seen by many people as information, and this information is then polemicized with, or people try to confirm it, or people start to get depressed when this information is not reported. All of these are things that are purely opinions. So the authorities themselves are setting anti-standards, so to speak, in the use of real information. And we have to start with ourselves. Next is access to information, public access to information. We're also talking in the earliest weeks of war, how channels were switched off, Prямые and Espresso, and the fifth channel, Channel 5. And I've since then been visited the parliamentary committee where everybody said they had nothing to do with it, and representatives of the Otar said, yes, well, yeah, they did disconnect it, but they will not say why, and they will not say who told them to. This is a violation of standards when official people are saying, well, yes, we switched off the channel because we didn't like the behavior of the owner of two of those channels. We don't like him as much as he likes himself. Now, again, this is also in violation of the standards during the war, because during the war, you can't have these kinds of assessments from the authorities to informational collectives if they're not in violation of the law. And you could come up with numerous examples like this. So we have to start with the fact that we have state institutions that have not stood up to the challenge. So the president who speaks to the citizens every day, who addresses various parliaments and international bodies to gain attention to the Ukrainian to Ukraine, and then you have state institutions who cannot answer simple requests and simple needs of the citizenry. By the way, this is also dangerous because we have the experience of the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, where the Armenian authorities kept their citizens in a completely distorted picture of what was happening. And this is quite important. You do not speak to citizens as children. After the reality won in the war against television and the official reports, there was an explosion. There was an emotional explosion that almost disassembled the state. We have to prevent this. Yes, partly, yes. We have to prevent this. In any case, the authorities have to understand that you have to speak to citizens like they're adults. And I often hear from my viewers and readers that I depress them. Well, it's not my job to make you feel better. It's my job to provide you with adequate information or a set of assessments that correspond to the moment. And this is supposed to be the task of everyone in this situation, because we have to understand that we're not dealing with today. We're dealing with what's going to happen tomorrow, and tomorrow will come. And if we talk about that tomorrow will come, we have to understand another thing. Like, there's an important day when we might get the status of the candidacy of the EU membership. Among the conditions that will be given us in order to not lose this status is the media law and creating normal European standards in freedom of speech. We have to understand that to this day we have had a post-Soviet hybrid journalism that is much more similar to Otar, you spoke of the market, right? We don't have a market. Right, yes, right. There is no market, right. And this is an important aspect. Journalism is a market. Otar is right. Well, I would say that the fact, yeah, the market crash, of course, it was pretty. That's one of the reasons, yeah, maybe. And in any case, we have to understand that the journalism that we have had so far is much more similar to Russian or Belarusian journalism than, I don't know, German or French with all the resentment that I have for those media traditions at the moment. And we have to, if we want to survive, we have to build civilized journalism with standards, because we have the simple choice. You know, we have the European Union or the Soviet Union. We already have Soviet journalism. We can join the Russian Federation with journalism tomorrow. There won't be any problems, because what is Soviet journalism? And it's the kind of new neo-Soviet journalism. It's an oligarch who tells the journalist what to write. Today they support Ukraine. Tomorrow they support the Kiev National Republic. Right? True journalism is journalist of standards and analysis, and that is very important. And we're just starting to build that journalism, starting from today. We've been circling around for 30 years. That was essentially repeating the post-Soviet traditions of kind of amoral behavior. There's your question of moral. Sorry. Can I just jump in here? I have a question. I've heard this from Vitaly the third time on the war censorship, and I wanted to ask, how do you imagine the organization of this system in a country where you have 1,000 TV channels and 10,000 online publications, and everybody has their... No, I mean strictly for a state body that would allow to... So who would work in such a body? What's their competence? It, okay, competence is simple. If a warrior dies, you do not report the name of the fallen. Yes, but the killing of a warrior is not the only thing that may... Of course, of course. Movements of troops in the territory. This is the situation on the front line, shellings. Exactly. Things like this. War censorship has to do only with military competencies. It doesn't have to do with non-military authorities, volunteers, politicians, deputies, ministers, etc. No, specifically what is happening in regards to the war. Not what to do with, I don't know, economics or the Ministry of Defense. No Israeli journalist asks permission to publish a text on the corruption on the general's headquarters. He will only ask this if he's killed. Should he be killed in a military operation, and then his name cannot be publicized. If he's under investigation, then of course military censorship doesn't apply. So I like this idea, but I'm remembering how after February 24th, absolutely all of the state bodies stopped responding to any questions. You couldn't ask them anything other than at the press conference. This is exactly what I mean. This is what the institution of military censorship means. You have to respond in 48 hours. That is what it means. Either they allow you to publicize or they do not allow it, but they have to do this within a certain... If they're not doing this, they're violating the law, and then you have the right to publish the information as you see fit, because they have time to respond. All of this is, of course, legally. We can take this law, some law. It doesn't have to be the Israeli law. We can look at a law, how it's done in a civilized world. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I don't mean censorship. I mean limits on what... on disseminating, shall we say, sensitive information. It's just the word censorship is... No, it's a great idea, but implementing... Okay, if there are questions, we'll be prepared to take them, but please raise your hands and we'll then take those questions. I have a quick comment here, real quick. If we talk as far as fact checking is concerned, yes, but so maybe then, do we need to monitor Russian media? Do we need to use them? Ought we to use them in our work? I just wanted to add to the previous discussion that we as media in Ukraine, we've stopped being the watchdog of democracy, right? The wartime we're not really doing a lot of investigations. We sort of understand that there are abuses um, by authorities or by people who are responsible for even the most basic things that each volunteer is in humanitarian aid. Um, there's stuff going missing, and even our discussion can be seen as a hybrid threat, right? Um, this is something that so we can get hate even in the social space because we're starting to talk about this. And should we read Russian media? Well, if we were a completely rational world, a completely emotionless world that can separate facts from assessments and opinions, then of course we could do this easily. We could read, we could separate, 99.9% of propaganda and use the truth that is there, or pass this information on those who fight evil, among the journalists who will filter the information, who will then provide this to Ukrainian media that works for the common good for all the institutions involved. But that's not how it works, really. So likely, it's much easier right now to not support the kind of the search engines, because this is also one of the things that we've been doing with our students. We've been looking at how much we're losing in purely just in terms of Google, how the first 10 results, if we're talking about the most dramatic events happening in the course of the war, whether it's a bombing or a killing, and usually the English-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking content will be in the top 10 results. But if we're talking about German media, no, RT is still within the top 10. If we're talking about the Spanish language, the same thing. It's either some information bogs, or I've had the same feeling in Brazil when we're doing just online streams and meetings with students, with university students and schools and lyceums. And they knew nothing about what's happening in Ukraine. B, their knowledge that that they remotely had, like let's say the more advanced students remotely had, was extremely Russo-centric, was extremely reeked of Russian propaganda. So that's sort of as far as Russian media as a source, I would say definitely no, because I don't see particular use. Even when there are discussions on should we monitor, ought we to monitor the statements of the official authorities, considering that they might be lying and trying to read the tea leaves what a particular lie might mean. Well, I think I think the amount of effort you will waste is not commensurate with the use that you will gain from it. As far as research interest, of course, it's quite useful, and we should then look not at the media as such, as like official media or central or state media. We should look at dynamics of what's happening in the social media in some distant regions of Russia, precisely where the soldiers have been mobilized to Ukraine, who've been killing and who've come to kill and die in our territories. Are there some processes? Are there some? Uh, so that's interesting, but I doubt that that's a priority right now. It truly is much more interesting to look at the impact of Russian media personages on what is known about the situation in Ukraine uh, uh, in by journalists and media in the world, because I'm sure that many media, I have this distinct impression that many media look at the situation in Ukraine through Moscow, which is a huge challenge for us because our messages have to contest this. But again, this is scholarly interest, and also wanted to talk about the absence of investigations and such. Coming back to standards, investigative journalists have reprofiled. Investigation don't have to do with corruption right now, although I'm sure that investigators are documenting these things but not publicizing them. Investigators are more focused on looking at the crimes of Russian aggression in the territory of Ukraine. Well, yeah, we were talking about how we had these two very interesting stories in the last 24 hours. Firstly, all of the Ukrainian media talked about the death of Yura Shatunov, right? Without mentioning that he's a Russian singer. Yura Shatunov dies in the Medvedevo hospital. This was, by the way, but this was a publication. I read this in a publication that is waving the Ukrainian flag. Right, it's a clickable thing. And then the second story was our story when yesterday we had news that Turkey and Russia have agreed on the export of grain. We spoke to the ambassador. He said, no, that's not true. That was a purely Russian story uh, picked up by our publications, and not one Ukrainian publication have called our embassy to clarify what's happening. So again, the question is about the impact of Russian sources of Russia. Again, it brings us back. Should we look at it? Should we use it? Well, again, this is what I mean. We're doing this kind of investigation, as Zoya says. Our Petro Borkovsky, an analyst, is reading regional Russian media, creating, and he comes up with very interesting conclusions. In the regional and local Russian media, they report news that will never make it kind of to central channels, including there's direct testimony of the problems of the Russian authorities. For instance, there's confirmed information in the media, in these media, about very weak and sometimes even zero meeting of the quota, of the draft quota. So Russians are refusing to join the army. Of course, the Russia Today will not tell you that, and official bodies will not tell you that, but the local newspapers will write about it. So the system of Russian media is obviously propagandist, but it is not a monolith. And sometimes in the regions there are, you know, journalistic traditions. I mean, much like in the Soviet Union, regional media might have had some glimpses of uncontrolled or less controlled journalism. So as far as using Russian media as sources, including liberal Russian media as sources, I think this can be done only with only while only if you can test it or second check, recheck it. And if we have to use this information, then you have to distance yourself to the extent that it's at all possible, to understand that this is not a fact, but this is a statement from a Russian source that we cannot consider it a fact because we have not verified it. Unfortunately, they're not held to any standards as far as truth is concerned. I just thought how horrible that we are constantly in this same information field. In the 70s and the 80s, a colleague of mine in the Russian service of Radio Liberty, Lev Reutman, was looking at regional Soviet presses, and he had this popular show called Soviet Union Events, Problems, and Opinions. Now, this was completely based on regional sources, Soviet regional sources, and there was later even some research. When the editor told me how they were looking at all these local newspapers while based in Munich. How do you get all the various Krasnaya Znamya from Izhevsk or whatever? Subscription? No, we couldn't do subscription. You couldn't do international subscription, but somebody would send them. There would be some mail. There were some agents. It was a whole story. People did time for that. People could get arrested for sending regional Soviet press. Now either Lev nor Ruslan are alive, and we're talking about the same practices because nothing's changed. So what I want to say is that the problem of our journalism that has always been with us is the Russophonia, Russophonia of its authors. It's much easier to read news from a Russian source. It's always been that, and I've always said this, particularly to international journalists, people who even read international information. It's much easier to read it in Russian than to read it in some other language if you don't know that language. Today, that problem no longer exists. I mean, thanks to translators and Safari and Chrome, you can read in any language of any paper, basically up to 90% accuracy, so to speak, right? You mentioned this story about the agreement between Turkey and Russia. When just the idea arose, it really was reported by Russian media, but quoting Miliet. And when I read that article in Miliet, that story in Miliet, which first of all was huge, Secondly, was about 90% factually different from what was reported in Russian sources. This happens with all of the statements and all the citations of international sources in Russian media. I know how they do this because I've worked with these people for many years, and I understand their level of their capacity for manipulation. And I always say, look, you don't have to read this. I always tell this to my colleagues. All these official reports from Russia, they usually distort reality even when they clearly cite international sources, some Western sources, some official body, or some publication, because it may turn out that the Western body or the Western functionary or the Russian have said something completely different. So if you're reading in Russian, at least check the sources. I mean, I would say you don't have to read the Russian sources. Now, I do because I study Russia. Not Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but Russian politics to the extent that it can be studied. I read the Kaliningrad sites right now very, very attentively. I've done this for many years. I'm coming back to these. I really have to understand what is going on with the transit. And it turns out nothing's happening, nothing in particular. Which is completely opposite to what the Moscow press is saying. But it's not the job of our journalists who use Russian media in the context of either the war or the response of the world to the war, which is again distorted by Russian propaganda, even when we're talking about uh, Russia-friendly countries. If we're looking at Kazakh sources, we would know that there was no sensation, that Tokayev presentation in St. Petersburg wasn't any kind of sensation, although for us it was a sensation, and so was it for the Russians, even though they don't read anything apart from their own sources. And this is very interesting that the Western press sees Kazakhstan also through Moscow's eyes, because the correspondents are in Moscow, and sometimes they might call some Kazakh expert, some official Kazakh expert, who will say, no, what Tokayev says, that he doesn't recognize DNR and LNR, it's out of love for Vladimir Putin. And they see this as kind of pure, verified, trustworthy information. This is how this information then circulates. Basically, I say you should see the Russian media space, as something that either services the authorities or the delusions of those who call themselves liberal journalists, because this liberalism it simply has to do it only has to do with kind of a negative attitudes to the present policies. But in terms of questions of values, it may be very different than our ideas of the reality and the Western ideas of reality. Also, in terms of liberal journalists, the question is, to what extent do Ukrainian authorities or Ukrainian experts, to what extent are they supposed to work with them, respond to them? Because these media, I mean, you have to analyze what percentage of Russian population is covered by this media, and how far their signal goes, considering all of the blocking of the information they provide. So it's simply not. Well, right. It's like what we think when we think that Nevzorov is an alternative to Solovyov. I've heard this from Ukrainian. No, Nevzorov is somebody for international Russians and for Ukrainians who are happy that there are Russians who can say bad things about Russia. Russian audience don't call about him, and also about this other world, just so we understand. So I opened Facebook today, for instance, and a well-known liberal oppositionary Russian journalist responded to an ordinary post on June 22nd. Of course, June 22nd is a tragic day, but the war started on September 1st, 1939. Soviet soldiers performed crimes perpetrated crimes in Germany in the last months of the. And this needs to be remembered. For us, this is basic stuff. And this journalist responded, "How can you write this? How dare you? My parents didn't kill anyone and didn't rape anyone. They fought. Blah blah blah." My father was an intelligence officer in Kaunas. Right, Kaunas is Lithuania. It's occupied by the Soviet Union. Do you not understand this? No, I will tell you how they were killing Jews in the. So this is what begins, right? This is the exact narrative that we're hearing from Soviet propaganda and Russian propaganda, except that it's now voiced by somebody who's an icon in our media here, who keeps speaking in our channels with commentary, but she sees the world through the same eyes as Putin does. It turns out if you dig even slightly deeper, right? Or another example of standards of Russian media, liberal media. Yes, they call the war a war. Russia is responsible for aggression in Ukraine. But when they tell stories of people who were evacuated to Russia from Mariupol, who were deported, I don't want to name the publication. It's not particularly popular. But firstly, you have to look at, is this truly evacuation or is this forced deportation? And then they're talking to a woman and they always note, right? Because the standard of balance, right? That to the question of who fired, who shot, she doesn't know the answer. Well, of course, she might not know the answer. But the question is, should this be stated? Is this a question of balance? Can this woman be competent to talk about this? And can she be free to answer in the Russian Federation? Was there a question? Yes, could you give the microphone, please? Hello, Andriy Maranyuk, editor-in-chief of Halinfo. While wartime censorship is not introduced here, which I think would really simplify the work for journalists, what do you think should the standards of journalism, how do you think the standards of journalism coexist with state propaganda that is, of course, that is working there? Do we have state propaganda? Well, I say, considering the number of the amount of information produced by official authorities, I would say yes. Well, this is what I said. There are problems that have existed for a long time in journalism, but that have intensified with the war. Propaganda is propaganda. Journalism is journalism. Those are separate things. And when I was monitoring the news, when we were analyzing standards, I was really sent by the fact that journalists, only quote information, only quote the reports by the police or the security service without alternative sources. So the sources, you have to have alternative sources apart from the official, apart from what the state says, so that we understand what is actually true. And the editing board, I don't know if it's part of like wartime censorship, or I don't know what the rules will be, when, after what procedure can information be reported, but there have to be clear criteria of when the editing board understands that the value of this information far outweighs silencing it. Yeah, I only wanted to add at this stage that according to an American scholar from the 80s, Lippmann, he separated this kind of, I think he called it white propaganda, and that's basically popularization of positive behaviors, positive events, humane, healthy attitudes, or forming social attitudes to some phenomena that exist. So it seems to me that today journalism in Ukraine has switched to that kind of affirmative propaganda, positive propaganda, white propaganda, right? When we say, look, sorry, but it's a very, I mean, we talk about, we talk about everything that we can talk about to the extent that we can, and that is the state of war. That is something that is required of us, and that what is expected of us by Ukrainian society, by the reader. They expect these positive news and positive analysis of how the military campaign is even going. That we talk more about positive events or less about negative events, because then it can be used by Russian propaganda. And we've switched to the kind of the side of this popularization of Ukrainian side, and this is something that I think, fortunately, we have now. But depending on the duration of the war, will we then not lose our capacity for criticism? Okay, let me clarify then. Is there any difference between journalists and propaganda, and how then should, and how then does a white propagandist not wake up as a negative propagandist? Right, and it's a good question from my colleagues. Right, that's what they said. Right, Gandalf the Grey becomes Gandalf the White, right? Okay, so I don't think that a journalist has to be a propagandist. Good, bad, white, black, blue, green, I don't care. The job of the journalist is competent information and evaluation of facts. it's not even the job of the journalist, even the job of the publicist. Just that I'm a publicist, but my colleagues who are reporters, I don't expect them to evaluate facts. But that, right. When I was a journalist, when I was a reporter, I wasn't evaluating facts. I was reporting facts. Newsmaker 1, Newsmaker 2, Newsmaker 3, goodbye. And it's a completely different job. But even a publicist cannot be a propagandist, because if they're hiding, so their evaluation of reality has to be based on facts. If your evaluation of reality, your assessment of reality is based on invented facts, then you have to be, I don't know, advisor to head of something for some reason. But a real publicist has to be based on real facts. And this is why advisors of God knows who, God knows where are always more popular among the mass audience than people who supply real information, because invented facts are always more pleasant and prettier. It's just prettier than reality. But it's a question of, let me just respond. You will have to pay for it in 2-3 weeks, in a month, in a year. Life will overcome invention. This is something, by the way, that should be written on the gates of the Kremlin, and that is something that we definitely must not emulate. I remember very well all of these Russian tricks when there was the first war in Chechnya, the second war in Chechnya, when they said, oh, they would take Grozny in a week. It's the same thing. And this was stated by serious people, official figures. And then payback would arrive when the experts who had said, when the experts said what it would be like, it would not be seen. But you have to pay for the facts, so to speak. You have to pay for the truth. It's the job of any journalism. It's something that has to be the answer to our discussion today. You have to face the facts. You can't make up facts. We keep making up facts. We keep inventing facts in military, in wartime conditions, because we want fact to be better than it was earlier, right? We want the collapse of Putin's blitzkrieg is not the disappearance of Russia from the map, as much as we would love to state this 1 week after the war started. But this was what we reported. We heard this from many sources. Like, it's over. Russia is finished. In 2-3 weeks, in 4 weeks, it'll be over. And people said, look, this is going to be a long war of attrition. It may take months, it might take years for such and such reasons. If there's going to be these sanctions, it will take this long. If there are these sanctions, it will last this long. If this is how long it takes, we might lose this much territory, or this much territory might be occupied. These were calculations based on reality, and say, oh, look, they're defeatists. I see people very often, talking about propaganda. I often see people who tell me, look, we were listening to you, we're listening to your prognosis, your forecasts prior to the war, and we had time to leave some territories. We're grateful that we listened to you. And we left, we saved our children, or we saved our business, whatever. And then I meet in social media other people from the same regions who say they were listening to other people, and unfortunately they lost their family, they've lost people they love, they've lost their jobs, they've lost whatever. So this is no laughing matter. This isn't well, I said this opinion, someone else said another opinion. Well, yeah, he prettified it to calm people down. Look, it's a question of people's lives and fate and its responsibility. This is why I don't want to lie to people, because ultimately it's down to me, because of what decision people will make because they watched YouTube or TV, and I'll be responsible for their lives. I don't want to. I don't want to lie to them. Why their child later comes to me, listen, you said it was going to be okay. Well, my mom's dead. Because they listened to you, that everything's going to be fine. I'm not going to say that. Just very briefly, so this is a classic dilemma between the poet and the citizen. So the media have this kind of basic responsibility to their audience, right? Which means that they have to answer the questions of their audience, supply information, and not lie, not mislead the audience. When the media begin to get involved in, calming their audience and pointing their audience in some directions, that's where it starts getting dangerous. And within this responsibility, we cannot supply our audience with propaganda, because then we're working against their interests. We're fooling them, we're misleading them. Propaganda is in any case modulating and distorting reality, right? But at the same time, as citizens, we are responsible to our country, we're responsible to our state. And in some instances, we have to we have the duty to be quiet when perhaps we ought to have said something. Now, it's my opinion that no one in the media is obligated to report untrue facts, even if these facts are coming from official sources. Yes, official sources sometimes lie. Sometimes this is done in order to disinform the enemy. But if the army commander-in-chief comes to you and says, "Dear editor-in-chief, please publish this disinformation so that we can disinform the enemy," well, it'll be a difficult dilemma. But in most cases, this is not what happens. In most cases, people open the website of the military headquarters, and they do basic copy and paste. So I think if we know that something is not true, then we ought not to report it. If we see that some Arestovich story, is there to prettify reality and to hypnotize people, then we should not translate it. We should not transmit it. We should look at people who give us adequate forecasts, and this puts us. This resolves the propaganda question, because the field of propaganda becomes a parallel track. Probably you need propaganda, because otherwise the state cannot communicate. Not just our state, any state communicates with propaganda. Must we be a tool of propaganda? No, of course not. Yeah, Vitaly. Yeah, I'm ready to either take another question, because we're working for maybe another 15 minutes, and then you can talk individually. Why don't we give the microphone to our international colleague? We need someone to translate.
Just a second. Потрібно, ні? Okay.
All right, sure. Joe Eng, I'm an American, but I write for Estonian public broadcasting. And I'm seeing less and less coverage in American media about what's happening here. And I'm also a military historian, just retired. I'm concerned that the attention span in the United States and maybe other international countries will decrease with what's going on here over time, because this is going to be a long war. Do you have any concerns about that?
Yes, I do.
Sure. Yes. There is a certain level of concern, but I mean, it's a natural process, right? The more urgent the events, the more attention you get. Our job as media people, as people who work in media, as media experts, as the Lviv Media Forum, we also want to work on this. We want to build these networks, build these relationships with editors in order to engage them, get them involved in what's happening in Ukraine, in order to not simply impose some events on them or tell them, well, you have to write about Ukraine. They don't have to write. For us, it's priority number one for a long time. It will be for a long time. For the rest of the media in the world, and we have to take this into account, this is a subject. This is a topic that is very loud right now. There was this very heightened interest to what was happening, and I'm very grateful to the colleagues who have turned to us for commentary and asked what was happening. But we have to be proactive as well. And we have to ask, how can we interest this audience? How can we be clear to them? How can we find these entry points? How do we find these stories, these topics? There are many local journalists that can tell some unique stories that might be interesting to the media, but these networks have to be built, have to be sustained, and that is our job, that is our responsibility. You know, this is not the first war that I've written about, so I was prepared for the fact that the interests would wane, unlike many of my colleagues, because I remembered when we were writing about Yugoslavian war, when they were the hottest events, you know, when Dubrovnik was being on Srebrenica, Yugoslavia was there in the front pages of all the world press. And when when the war of attrition began, well, who cares? Bosnian Serbs are standing next to Sarajevo and they're just standing there. This was only interesting to us, people who were interested in Yugoslavia. Most of our colleagues were no longer interested. Then the war in Chechnya, right? The first weeks, it was everywhere. It was everywhere, on the front pages of all the international media. When the war of attrition in the Caucasus started, people who were, okay, Russian journalists were maybe interested. And even then, it disappeared from the front pages of the Russian. I mean, I remember even the death of Johar Dudayev was barely reported in international media. It's the same thing that was supposed to happen with Ukraine. You know, the first week, you know, the bombings, Bucha, all the stuff that hits the front pages. Yeah, now it's a war of attrition. I would say the opposite. I would love for the Ukrainian war not to come back to the front pages, because it would mean a serious deterioration of the situation. Bombing, the destruction of some big city, that's what brings the war back to the front pages. But I've already said that I think that the president of a country is doing a lot politically, and this has to be recognized, that to make the political elites interested in this. He keeps talking every day, you know, he talks every day in virtually in front of different colleagues. This is truly important, because this keeps the topic hot for political elites among those who make decision makers. And I think we should be more seriously engaged in this. In theory, many of us should be talking to international audience every day, specifically like that, in a kind of non-stop communication, to maintain that level of attention among the decision makers. So we don't need to speak to the masses. The masses, obviously they care about the destruction of cities and the murders, but then, which is normal for human psychology. But for those who form the agenda, who form decisions, who form the information, and we need to keep a dialogue with those people, and we need to think about how to maintain that dialogue. Sure, no, you can speak in Ukrainian, but we do have
the English language. So thank you. First of all, thank you for your work. It's very important for us. And after the 2011, after the crisis of the journalists all over the world, and especially in the United States, and you stand for us. This is very important, that you send the message and you transfer the message for all the world what is going on here in Ukraine. That our mothers, sons, daughters are killed by someone for no reason, non-understandable reason.
And you know, I'm truly grateful, because over this whole time we were talking more as an institution, as the Ukrainian Catholic University, with over 120 journalists who've lived in our campuses, who've stayed here, who spent time with our students every day, who were involved with people that we have sheltered in our walls, including journalists, including IDPs, internally displaced persons, that we could provide some modicum of help and support. It's been a delight to me and an honor to me to support Espresso in the earliest days of the war, to support Suspilne with providing the space, with housing and hosting journalists who were moving here from Kyiv. And it was no less an honor to host Deutsche Welle, Sky News, New York Times, Guardian, Telegraph, CNN, and other, who were simply, even journalists from Al Jazeera, although we're a Catholic university, we were happy, of course, to host them and to help them with their information, with access to our networks, the internet, anything they might need. And now, today, as Pan Vitaly has said, now it works on a personal level. If we've managed over this time of the war to become friends with international journalists, then we will remain, maybe not in the front pages, but we will remain within that information space. And that also has to do with values that Otar mentioned. that we have kind of become in sync in terms of values. The war was the catalyst for all of the criticism of Ukrainian journalism as a post-Soviet journalism. I think, sorry, yeah. So I think that we have quickly developed into, I think we have come a long way since the start of the war. I think we understood, or at least we're trying to sense, to palpate what journalism 3.0 is supposed to be in the future. So just to wrap up, I'm sure that we will remain within the information sphere, not like Syria did back in the day, Syria or Iraq, which was little points in particular world media, but through these connections that we have, through these links we have, I think we will remain and continue to fight in other spaces of the Western world. Yes, please. Just to be a propaganda tool here, very briefly, I will add to Vitaly's words that the fact that we're not on the front page means that there are no great tragedies. Well, unfortunately, the liberation of Kherson, I think, will deserve front page status. So I wish us all to come back to the front page news with good news. Sorry. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah, good events deserve front page status. I keep forgetting this. And then I have a final question. Just if you could say very briefly, because we have to wrap up. After which you will have the opportunity to speak individually to our speakers, and it's a very simple question, or a very complicated one, because it seemed to me, I had the impression that a journalist is someone who is supposed to be skeptical both to the political opposition and the authorities, who is supposed to be detached from both from the facts that they're writing about, who is supposed to be check themselves and their own work. Right now we're at war and there's emotion, there's that emotional response. How does a journalist remain a journalist in war? Do you know? Do you have an answer? You use your own personal filters and professionalism, because I think a journalist has to learn to separate his own personal opinion from facts, from understanding what's happening, and my desire to see. It's very difficult for Ukrainian journalists to separate their desire to see what they want to see, because of course we are citizens of our country, but it's possible. Hold to standards, keep to standards, act professionally. Again, don't forget who you are primarily responsible to. Who do you answer to? You answer to the people who call themselves their audience, who need results from you, the results of your work. Don't set yourself some unattainable goals. Don't beat yourself up for not liberating Ukraine with your daily work, or not killing Putin with your daily work. But value your work, respect your work, try to do it well. Again, we've had a lot of these phrases and discussions about, we're all warriors of the information front. Now, I don't think that every journalist has to be a warrior, but I do think that every journalist should do their work and do it honestly and well. And this is also useful for our victory, necessary to our victory, that to make sure that we even live to see our victory. I would probably say this will be a bit probably funny I would say pray and meditate, right? Find that time to quiet that information buzz. But apart from it, yes, standards of journalism, they keep you in shape. Remember that you're working professionally, and remember to separate often the tragedies that happen and your professional work. You can't do it fully. You will still be involved, but separate your professional work from your emotions. I think you can make parallels with doctors, because it's the same kind of work in these conditions, like in peacetime. How is a doctor supposed to stay a doctor at war? These are much worse conditions, right? You can't even compare to our situation, where there's constantly death, blood, gore, wounds. You have to constantly help, run, heal, but they're still doctors. Doctors are still doctors. It's their job. They understand in principle why they come to this profession. The same holds for journalism. We're doing our work. we're doing our job in extreme situations, but it has to remain professional and responsible, just as professional and responsible as in peacetime. What is a journalist supposed to do if they're supposed to stay a journalist, and not join the army or something? And when the war started, they have to work with the audience. You have to not let your emotions override your profession, because emotions that's up to the audience. You have to work with the audience, report facts, give opinions and assessments, link between the audience and the authorities, the audience and the experts. Everybody has their competence, but it's absolutely the same kind of work. Journalism is not any different from, I don't know, providing medical assistance in war. And this is why I think you have to stay journalists. Of course, if you once you agreed to this profession, you had to understand that this is what it's going to be like, that these are going to be the challenges you have to face. If you did not understand that, I don't really understand why you decided to do this. To show up on a screen or write a text that some number of people would write. Look, that's a completely different thing. Thank you for that answer. I think this is not our last conversation. I'm sure we will continue talking like this or in other formats and talk about journalism as well, but information about the profession. With us were Vitaly Portnikov, a journalist and publicist. With us was Andriy Shestak, director of the UKU School of Journalism and Communication, Otar Dovzhenko, head of the International Media Council, and Zoya Krasovska, media expert and analyst of the Lviv Media Forum. Thank you very much. See you